Hi! We are back for chapter 22 of With We Were Giants, and we are now in part 3 of the Forest Giants. So this is going to be a chance for Kira to use her storytelling skills to perhaps get all of the tree folk to follow her along. This chapter is also about 15 pages long, so we will be here for a little bit. So Kira sat atop the rocky ridge by the lake in the soft morning light, trying to calm her nerves. Besides Luan, Loba, and Maham sitting beside her, the clearing was empty. They had been waiting for over a half an hour, and she could tell from their uneasy silence that the others were feeling more than a little edgy too. As she looked around at the bare trees and vacant meadow, Kira honestly did not know which was more unsettling to think about, having to make a speech in front of the entire tree folk community, or the prospect of no one showing up at all. Finally, Loba spoke in a half-whisper. "Are you sure you and your friends told everybody that the meeting was this morning?" "Of course, Father," Luan shook his head. "I'm not a child anymore, you know." "All will be well." Maham placed a hand on Kira and Luan's shoulders. "This is just a very unusual request for these people. It might take them some extra time." Several more minutes had passed and still nobody came. For moral support, Kira stole glances at the place where Mome had shown her the ants, the remarkable structure. Stronger together. If only the people would turn up, she would try to make them see that. Luan started to scowl and fidget with his hands, which didn't ease anyone's anxiety. But then she saw him break into a huge grin. Kira looked questioningly at him and pointed. She turned to see Tiha silently stepping onto the clearing behind a tree. The master builder was followed by 6 people who could only be her parents and brothers. They all shared the same stoic expression. They were also all carrying large knapsacks. Tiha briefly lifted her hand in greeting, and her family wordlessly sat down in the wild grass. Shortly after that, Makina emerged from the tree line on the opposite side of the surrounding woods, leading a gaggle of younger sisters and even tinier than her. She waved enthusiastically, and her sisters intimidated her, all with beaming smiles. Kira returned both the smile and the wave, which helped allay her nervousness a bit. Finally, Kuri and Mozan appeared, but they were by themselves. Could they not talk their parents into coming? If Luan's friends couldn't even get their families here, what hope did they have for anyone else showing up? The butterflies started to flutter in Kira's belly once again. Well, at least a few tree folk are here. They would just have to... It was hard to say when it started, because the people in the forest were so quiet and moved with such stealth, but as Kira looked around at the surrounding trees, she realized that there was definitely more than a few. People parted leaves in the upper branches to see out, revealing huddled groups of 3 or 4 in a wide branch. Others dropped to the low-hanging limbs to sit at the base of the trunk, while some were bold enough to step out of the forest and sit in the open. And some had perhaps been there all along, seated amongst the branches, their camouflage clothing and natural stillness allowing them to blend into the woods. Over the next several minutes, the forest surrounding the clearing was filled with people. Kira turned her neck as far as it could go in both directions and took it all in. There must have been several hundred people gathered here, and they all kept coming, perhaps over 1,000, maybe even 2,000. Kira would never have dreamed that there were this many tree folk. And had she really thought she was nervous before, that was just a mild case of the jitters. Now it felt like she couldn't breathe. Though none of these people knew it, their fate rested on Kira's words and how much she could encourage and inspire them to respond. It all depended on her. When the emergence of newcomers slowed to a trickle and finally appeared to stop, Loba stood up on top of the ridge and surveyed all of the eyes looking down at him from the surrounding trees. Kira noticed his hands were trembling before he clasped them together and took a deep breath. My name is Loba. I was born in the branches, as was my father and his father before him. He was speaking loudly but not shouting. There was no need. The people in the clearing were so quiet and focused that his voice was able to carry to the entire assembly. I am not a man of many words, but my family and I want to thank you for coming here this morning. We know this is unusual. After spending my entire life in this forest, I do not remember a single time that all of us were called together. It is not our nature to decide things as a group. We take care of our own and let others do as they will. Excuse me again. Allergies are a little tough today. Loba swallowed heavily, appearing to search for the right thing to say. This clearly did not come naturally to him, and Kira's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that he was going through it solely on the basis of her word. Anyway, I say this because you must know I do not treat this lightly, but events had taken place recently that could have had dire consequences for all of us, and we could be asking for your help to put things back in order so you may all go on living your lives as normal. Loba turned around and motioned to Kira, who stood up. She felt very small in the middle of all of those branches. This is Kira. She was not born in the branches. She did not start out this life as one of us. Loba turned and looked right into her eyes as he spoke. But I have come to trust her, and I respect her. I never thought I would say this about an outsider before I met her. We have fully accepted Kira into our family. I consider her my daughter. And if you have any trust for me as a lifelong member of the Tree Folk, I would like you to extend the same respect to her as she speaks with you now. Kira, standing there before the entire crowd, didn't know whether to thank Loba or curse him. His public support certainly helped steady her nerves, but how was she supposed to speak around the lump that was forming in her throat? It had been so long since someone had called her daughter, and she thought she would never hear that word again. Brushing a stray tear from the corner of one eye, she took a shaky but deep breath and spun around slowly to take in her audience. And as she did so, a warm and familiar feeling of calm washed over her as she realized something very important. This was the storyteller's circle. She could see that now. How many times had she watched the first man who called her daughter perform in front of an audience? Perhaps not a crowd this big, of course, but there was perhaps not a crowd this big, of course. But was there really any difference? She had seen Taro speak to groups of the elderly, or hordes of children, gatherings of families and unfamiliar faces in distant villages. She had observed him closely, studied the way as he drew people and delivered the goods. She also had kept an eye on the crowds and discovered something else. Everyone loved a good story. Taro was skilled, for certain, but at the end of the day, he was merely giving the people what they wanted. And her father, her first father, has chosen her helper position perfectly. Taro had seen it before she had. This is what Kira had been born to do. If Taro had felt she was capable of carrying on his legacy and tell meaningful stories that make an impact on others, if Loba trusted her, and so did Maham and Luan and his friends, then she knew she could do this. The nerves melted away and she began to speak. As Loba says, I was not born here, but the place I had came from had many similarities. We also hid ourselves from the outside world. My ancestors built a perfect community deep inside the hollow crater of a dormant volcano. Kira described the towering walls of stone that protected Sudu like a fortress, throwing her hands in the air to illustrate their vastness. She paced around the ridge in a circle, describing what various clans on the with different terraces that had lined the interior, and how they worked together to bring resources to all of the people in the community. Making broad gestures to the surrounding trees and meadow and lake, she praised the natural beauty of the land of the tree folk and explained that the Zeduans also had a respect for nature and had similarly thought to live in harmony with their surroundings. Her face grew stronger as she described her native home. It was the opposite of a memory trap. Instead of letting the dark things drag her down, the bright and beautiful things that she'd experienced were infusing her with the confidence and power. To remember everything, both the good and the bad, was to honor those whom she had loved. She rotated, taking in the entire audience. When you have been born and raised in such a special place and taught to respect your lands and live within your means, then all of you have already been lucky enough to experience, it can be difficult to understand those who do not. It can, in fact, be difficult to even acknowledge that such people could exist. She paused dramatically, because she knew it was something Tara would have done at this moment. That was another memory that lifted her up and empowered her once as she was allowed to come back again. During the pause, she scanned the crowd, establishing direct eye contact with as many people as she could, forging a personal connection with her audience, just as she had been taught. Finally, she spoke again. But I have met such people. And she slipped from the storyteller to actor, as all good tale spinners must do at times. As she described Redstreak addressing his troops, she became the man. She puffed up her chest and made her voice gruff, using hand gestures to suggest his bulging muscles, intimidating armor, and cruel weaponry. She imitated him as he bullied the Nephilu captive and snarled bloody orders at his men. With a rush of pride, she had noticed something happening in the crowd, the same thing she had observed when her first father competed in the storytelling competitions. People were turning to one another, nodding in approval or making faces to their neighbor that said, "Oh, my, did you hear that?" She knew they were with her. Time to press on. And now these people had come to our lands. You may have noticed them in the past few weeks, crossing the river at its lowest point and hunting in our forests. And if you saw them, you must have noticed that each one carried out as much game as possible, trip after trip. It's not hunting, it's plunder. That is their nature. My people called them the takers because that's what they do. They take beyond reason. She swept her hands with a flourish to indicate the surrounding woods. You have all learned the lesson, passed down from each generation, to leave a healthy population of each type of beast so the hunt may continue for the next season. Why? Even the hook hunters have enough sense to follow that rule. This earned a ripple of laughter through her audience. Now that she had them, really had them, it was time to lower the hammer. Get to the meat of this meeting. But these takers cannot be reasoned with, and they have discovered our little corner of paradise in this world. They have warned us, she said. She paced a bit. No, that's not quite right. Another pause, another scanning of the crowd. They have threatened us. They had vowed to return after the rainy season ends and the river becomes crossable again. The best outcome we can hope is that they wipe out the entire store of beasts. The best outcome we can hope for is that they wipe out the entire store of beasts, fish, and birds in the forest and make their home unlivable. The more likely scenario, however, is that they not only do that, but also destroy the trees and enslave us. Or worse, simply wipe us out. Kira paused and took a deep breath, but not for dramatic effect, because she knew this part would be difficult to say. She didn't dress it up with any storytelling tricks or flourishes. She just said simply, "That's what happened to my beloved community. The takers barged in, took what they wanted, and burned the rest. I am the only survivor of my people." Kira found strength in the fact that she had gotten through that part without breaking down in tears. Her voice was clear and powerful when she said, "They must be stopped when they return, and we are the only ones who can stop them." It was silent for a good long spell while this information sank into the crowd, until an older man, his customary long beard and gray, stood up from where he had been sitting at the base of a nearby tree. "I'd like to ask a question." Kira turned to face him. "Yes?" "Well, these Taker people found us because the river got lower than normal with the dry season, so they came over here to hunt." The man pulled on his beard, glancing around the crowd and seeming to realize that for the first time just how many people he was addressing. But he gathered his courage and pressed on. "You never told us how it happened in the volcano place, though, I mean. If you were also well hidden for so long, how did they find you?" Kira calmly looked back at the man. Instead of being filled with dread at this question, as she expected it would happen, she felt a sense of relief. If she were ever truly going to be a part of the tree folk, a full member of Luan's family, she was going to have to be honest about everything. And if they kicked her out, then that's what it was meant to be. She would prefer an honest exile to staying here in deceit. She pivoted to look at Luan's family, making eye contact with each of them in return, and then faced the old man again. "It was my fault," she said loudly. "I snuck out one night against the will of my parents. I wanted to gather information on the Takers to help protect my community. I found their camp, but I became frightened of what I discovered. I lost my nerve and escaped, and I tried to sneak back home, but they followed me. It all happened very quickly after that. Over the course of the next day and night, my community was destroyed." Kira hadn't truly noticed the pressing weight that had been stooping on her shoulders and bearing down on her chest for years, making it difficult for her to take a full breath, until it lifted with those words. She felt new, remade. It was completely quiet in the clearing after Kira's confession. She stood there, very still, and waited for whatever would come next. "Boba," someone called from high in a tree. "Why did you bring her into our forest? She admits to already destroying one community." "Yeah," a cry from the other side of the clearing. "She's dangerous. Why would we listen to her? She doesn't belong here. She never belonged here." There were rumblings at all sides. Boba shifted uneasily, looking unsure of how to respond. Kira had the same thought she had in the hunter's camp. People were capable of anything when they were scared. One man broke away from those sitting in the clearing, standing up and stalking directly toward the ridge. Kira tensed. But as he got closer, Kira recognized the braids and smooth, easy stare. She was starting to breathe again. Mome climbed up from the side of the ridge, his scarred and powerful hands finding sure grip on the stone. He stood beside Kira and stared down at the audience until the murmured protest had faded completely. Then he addressed the assembly. "I too was not born in the branches. I have traveled widely across this big world." He pointed around at the crowd. "This had been a reason many of you don't trust me fully. I accept that. However, it is the main reason you should listen to me now and heed my words. You people are fortunate to have spent all of your lives here. This is a special place. It is beautiful and peaceful, and you have taken good care of it. But what you have here is unique. There are, unfortunately, people like the Takers all over in every land." He put his arm around Kira. "This brave young lady did not bring the Takers to her home. They were already on their way. They started their inevitable march to that volcano when time began. Yes, perhaps the actions of a frightened young girl cracked the door open a bit sooner than it might have been opened otherwise. But the Takers were coming, and they would have knocked down that door eventually no matter what." He paused, looking around slowly, eyes boring into any member of the audience who dared to meet his gaze. "And now that they are on your footstep, how you choose to deal with it is up to you." Mome raised his voice, and it rang out to every corner of the clearing. "This girl is not condemning you. She is trying to save you. And would you do well to respect her words and do what she says? He pulled Kira closer and hugged her. Did you hear what I said, Meerkat? He whispered in her ear. The terrible things that happened were not your fault. You have to understand that. She had been waiting years for someone to say these words. Momay had not just said them to her. He had stood there in the first public meeting in the tree folk history and told everyone. She had no words of her own beyond thank you. She felt more arms around her and looked up to see that Maha had joined them. She was quickly followed by Luan and Loba. All four of them held a grateful Kira in their collective embrace. Tiha left her brothers and climbed onto the ridge, and then Makina and Kuri and Mozan did the same. The little group huddled together on the outcropping of stone, loving and supporting Kira in front of everyone who made up their world. Finally, the man with the gray beard spoke up again, loud enough for everyone in the clearing to hear. I heard your story, young woman, with my ears. He thumped his chest, and with my heart. He pulled on his beard and looked around at the audience before turning back to Kira. Okay then, is that what you want us to do? What is it that you want us to do? So there was the end of chapter 22, and here we are. So again, just getting closer and closer to the end. So I will see you again later.